Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this evening's Join Enough talk. And we're very pleased to welcome this evening Phil Callaghan, who's the Church Community Development Manager at Trussell, which used to be known as Trussell Trust. He's worked in a number of Christian organisations, and he's now responsible within Trussell for partnerships and relationships with churches. He'll be explaining the current expansion of Trussell's work, and also their new and added focus on examining the root causes of food poverty, why it happens, and what we can do to end it. So Phil, thank you again, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Kat, for the invitation to speak to you this evening. As John says, my name's Phil, and it's a real pleasure to be with you this evening, just to share some thoughts around, as John said, really thinking a little bit upstream. How are we ending hunger across the UK and within our local communities? This is merely an introduction to some of our work at Trussell. I couldn't possibly give justice to all of the programmes of work that are being delivered across the UK within the 20 or 30 minutes that I've got this evening to speak to you. So I do encourage you to kind of look at our website and get in touch if there's anything that triggers the imagination this evening that you think you'd like to hear more about or get involved in. It's really great to be speaking to you tonight because we really recognise at Trussell that we cannot fulfil our mission and vision of ending hunger on our own. We absolutely need communities across the UK to join with us in that vision and mission in order for us to be successful. So I hope that kind of this next 20 or 30 minutes or so kind of inspires you to kind of maybe get involved in some of this work and work alongside us to end hunger. And as I say, this title is kind of ending hunger by looking upstream and thinking upstream. And so I'll be focusing on how and why social action and social justice have to go hand in hand if we're really to create systemic change in our communities and across the UK. So I'll just start by a little bit of an introduction. Some of you may have heard of Trussell before, some of you may not. As John said, some of you may have heard of us in our previous incarnation as Trussell Trust. We changed our operating name to Trussell last October, which I'll be honest is taking many of us within Trussell some time to get used to. So I'm sure it's taking lots of people in our communities up and down the country a long time as well. Trussell was founded in 1997 by two Christians within their local church. They'd spent a long time thinking about hunger across the world and in particular parts of Eastern Europe and really responding to that. And one day they were approached by someone in their locality in Salisbury who said they were hungry, a young mother who said they were hungry and needed support in feeding herself and her children. And that really transformed their kind of mission and vision to responding to the needs of their local community. And that's where we started. And we've been responding to those needs of local communities across the UK ever since. But unfortunately, I've got some quite shocking statistics to start us with. And I really want to say that whilst we are a community of food banks, we have 1,200 food bank centres across the UK. We are first and foremost an anti-poverty charity. We're here to eradicate poverty from the UK. Last year, in those 1,200 centres, we gave out 3.1 million food parcels to people who are facing hunger and hardship, to people who are in crisis in our communities. And 1.1 million of those parcels were for households that contain children. Perhaps the most shocking statistic on the screen there is that this is a 94% increase over the last 4 years. I joined Trussell in 2022, and at that time, everybody talked about the great year of 2020 when everything went crazy, and people lost their jobs and we hit COVID and people really leaned on and relied on food banks, and our food banks mobilized in the most incredible ways in our communities. Unfortunately, we thought that that would be the high point. Unfortunately, that's really not been the case, and hunger and hardship is still at a horribly high level across the UK. I think another stat that's on here that many of us, and I'm sure you'll share this, will find shocking, is for 1 in 4 people who visit a food bank in the Trussell network, that's the only social interaction that they've had in the last month. And I think for those of us that are Christians and belonging to church, I think that's a really shocking statistic and shows a real a problem within our communities, a real breakdown in our communities. So that's just some of our, just to give a quick oversight of some of our current work. And just to put that into context in terms of our relationship with churches, we always say we were founded and guided by Christian principles. That's really, really important to who we are. We were founded by Christians in a church to begin with. And so it's really core to our identity. And today that relationship with the church and with local churches and church communities and Christians is still really important. We think we have around 12,000 relationships with different churches, communities across the UK. On average, each food bank is connected with 20 churches in some way. 98% of our food banks have volunteers or trustees that come from churches. 77% of our food bank centres are hosted in church spaces, and 27% of churches have joined with us in campaigning. There's a bit of a gap there between the 77% who host and the 27% who are joining us in that kind of campaigning work. And part of my role as church community development manager is to kind of bridge that gap a little bit and work out how churches and Christians can support us in finding some of those solutions at a community and at a UK-wide level to ending hunger. I just wanted to share this statistic, which just gives a little bit of an example of the rise in the number of emergency food parcels that Trussell Food Banks have given out over the last few years. You can really see there that steep kind of rise. So there was that slight drop off the year after COVID. We thought things are slightly going back to normal here, but since then we've seen a sharp increase. At Trussell, we've kind of had a front row seat, unfortunately, to the kind of crisis of hunger and hardship that you can see in the graph. And last year being our busiest year on record. And as I said earlier, about 3.1 million food parcels. I think when I started at Trussell back in 2022, I knew of food banks, I'd heard of them, I'd kind of worked alongside them a little bit, but I saw them as fairly kind of, or thought of them as fairly small operations that kind of ran out of churches. And yet when I started working alongside the food banks in our community, I was shocked at what I saw. I was overwhelmed by the sheer volumes of food on the shelves of food banks, the huge warehouse operations, that were being stocked and restocked. And still today, whenever I visit a food bank, 2 thoughts go through my head. The first is, thank goodness that they're here, that these people are here to provide for the needs of people facing hunger and hardship in their community. But my second thought, and equally as important, is this is a scandal. How can it be that we need this level of operation in 2025 in one of the most prosperous countries in the world? And I think it's really important that all of us that are connected with emergency food hold those 2 opinions together in tandem. Another reality that goes alongside the rising demand for food banks is the level of food which is being donated. In 2022, food banks only had to purchase 7.5% of the food that they provided. This has been the model that food banks have operated on since they existed, relying on donations so they could spend all the resources, all the monetary resources that they had on operational costs and preventative work. But as you can see from this graph, we've now got a huge gap. We're at the point where almost 1 in 3 food emergency parcels provided have been purchased. just in order for food banks to keep up with the level of demand. And it's just not sustainable. So with that comes significant barriers for our food banks, whether that be financial pressures from the sheer volume of stock that needs to be purchased, to how they can best support people who are being driven to the doors. So what does this mean for the future? Well, a colleague of mine earlier this year spent some weeks traveling around North America, in the USA and Canada, to learn about how their food banks operate. And as part of a really wide-ranging report, this one quote particularly really stood out to me. He said, "Food banking in North America is industrial. The buildings are monolithic, the sector is everywhere, and it all feels so permanent. It's become the social safety net. It felt like a terrifying glimpse of our future if we failed to turn the tide on food banks." A core part of the work that we do at Trussell is working with people who have recently or currently have experience of using a food bank or facing hunger and hardship. And it's absolutely necessary for us to implement what we call the participation principles, so that we're working towards solutions to the problems that our society has with the people who are facing the issues. And one of the people that work with us on this, we call our lived experience partners, is Laura. And I really like this quote. I think it's a really simple and effective way of talking about the issue at hand here. She said, "Running a food bank is like putting a sticking plaster on a volcano." So how do we think about turning the tide on the issue of hunger and hardship in the UK and ensure that we don't fall down that path of institutionalizing kind of our community of food banks? Well, just last month, Trussell launched our new strategy, Together for Change, it's called. And this strategy focuses on three key themes: ending hunger today, ending hunger together, and ending hunger forever. So let's think about ending hunger today. We know that due to the challenging economic outlook, we know that we'll need to continue to support significant numbers of people who are going without the essentials over the coming years. Ending hunger today means making sure that our food banks can be there for everyone who needs them, offering a warm welcome, emergency food, alongside tailored support and advice, making it less likely that they'll need to access the food bank again. Ending hunger together, as I said right at the beginning of this talk, we recognise at Trussell that us as an organisation and our community of food banks cannot solve the problem of hunger and hardship on our own. And to drive real change, we need to bring everyone, more and more people on board with us. We need to ensure that there's a real saliency to hunger and hardship within our society and within our communities. So ending hunger together means working with others, challenging, empowering people to play their part. And that's going to involve investing in collaborations across local communities, training, supporting anti-poverty leaders, and building the case for the public to prioritise tackling hunger and hardship. And then finally, forever. Our mission is clear at Trussell. We will not stop until everybody has enough money for the essentials, and the distribution of emergency food at this scale can end for good. Ending hunger forever means tackling the root causes of food bank need, challenging the systems and assumptions that leave people facing hunger and hardship. And that includes developing and influencing policy solutions and gathering and sharing vital insight about what will make lasting change, so we can take action together locally and across the UK. Many of you will be aware of this quote from the book of Micah. And in many ways, I feel that this quote that I know is used by lots of different social justice organisations with Christian links, but I really think that this kind of encapsulates our vision to end hunger today, together and forever really well. He has shown you what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So what does acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly look like in the context of fighting against hunger and hardship today? Well, loving mercy feels very closely aligned with our mission to end hunger today. How can we respond to the needs of the local community? When we think about walking humbly, we think, how do we work together to build communities where nobody needs to use a food bank? And acting justly is how we create a society and systemic change so that there are policies in place so that people don't fall into the hardship that they're facing today. So we see this vision that of a society within Micah 6:8, which calls for a change to the systems that drive people into poverty, which supports food banks with their operations, and which builds community with people facing financial hardship. Again, really core that the people who are facing financial hardship are brought alongside to work with us to create those solutions. And I'll be really honest. I think many of our churches and many Christians are excellent in this aspect of loving mercy. We rely so heavily on churches to support the operations of our food banks. Going back to one of my first slides, 70% of our food bank operations take place within church buildings. That alone, we wouldn't be able to exist and do what we do without the role of churches, and it's really important. But just a couple of initial ideas for churches that aren't less connected. How are you kind of supporting operations of a food bank to ensure that people aren't ending up hungry today? We saw the huge gap in donations that food banks are suffering with at the moment. So is there a point in the year, or is there regular donations that you could take place? Food banks are constantly looking for volunteers as well. If you have any spare time on your hands, and volunteers are like gold dust within the charity sector, we know that. But if you do have a local food bank, and I'm not just talking about Trussell food banks here, if there are independent food banks in your area too, think about whether you can offer a couple of hours a week. There are so many different volunteering roles within food banks these days, whether that's sorting food in the warehouse, whether it's providing cups of tea and conversations with people, signposting for people when they approach the food bank, driving all these different skill sets that are required now within a food bank operation. Particularly also trustees as well. I'm outside of Trussell. I'm a chair of trustees of a small Christian charity. I know better than anyone how difficult it is to try and get trustees. So if that's something that you think you're being called to, or can offer your services, please, I do encourage you to get in contact with your local food bank and have a conversation with them about that. I can assure you that they would welcome you with open arms. And then partnering again to think about, is my church community, is my church space a good place for a food bank to exist? Are we in the centre of a town? Do we have good accessibility? Is there a partnership potentially there to think about? And just a very quick one, if you have a local Tesco and you're popping in next week, we have our kind of UK-wide Tesco collection next week. So please do think about throwing in a few tins or a few things that food banks might need. So that's that kind of loving mercy, that thinking about what's our response to ending hunger today. And as I say, as church, I think we're usually very good at that stuff. I just want to touch a little bit on this acting justly. So I think all of us at some point all our lives are impacted by unjust systems. And sometimes it feels like a mountain to try and to bring down these unjust systems. We recognise that without UK-wide policy change, the issue of hunger and hardship will not change either. And so it remains imperative that we constantly call on the UK government to implement policies that mean less and less people will be in hunger and hardship. And one of those campaigns, probably the most important campaign that we've really thrown ourselves behind over the last 3 years, is called Guarantee Our Essentials. And effectively, It's because we recognise that people are being driven to the doors of our food banks because universal credit does not add up. Thousands of people are being driven to the doors because it doesn't cover the cost of life's essentials. The basic rate of universal credit for a single person currently stands at £92 a week, and it just simply doesn't add up. It needs to support anyone in need of help, and cover the costs of life's essentials like food and household bills and travel. But the shortfall between universal credit and the cost of living is forcing people to go without the essentials and then pushing them to the doors of the food bank. You'll just see here some stats that 5 in 6 low-income households are on universal credit and going without the essentials. The basic rate, that standard allowance of universal credit that I was talking about, is now its lowest ever level as a proportion of average earnings. Almost half of households see their payments reduced by deductions and caps. And we know that the general public agree with us on this. We know that through our studies that 72% of the public support an essentials guarantee. All we're asking for is the bare minimum that people can afford to have life's essentials. So I encourage you just this evening just to think about that. I'll put a link in the chat once I finish to the campaigning, and just think about what you can do as a church or in your local area or as a local community, and speaking to your MP about this. This is UK-wide government policy. We need to see this change. One of the activities that we recommend is this it doesn't add up receipt activity, where we get people to think about how much their life costs, how much does life's essentials cost for them in a week, and then you'll soon recognise that actually it's usually way above what the standard rate of universal credit is. So if we can't live on that ourselves, I don't know how we expect people to live and afford the essentials and not be driven to the doors of food bank once that money runs out at the end of a month. The second campaign that we are really involved in at the moment is on the 2-child limit. You may have seen lots about this in the news at the minute. Us, as well as our partners, are really ramping up on this at the minute as we face a UK budget next week in the House of Commons by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor. And we're really looking to put pressure on the government ahead of that budget. We've got a live email your MP action, which you can find on our website, which just provides you with a really simple way of saying, I'm very, very concerned about child poverty. We really believe that this 2-child limit must be removed. For people that aren't aware, the 2-child limit means that many low-income families don't receive further benefits when they have a third or subsequent child. And, no child should know what a food bank is. And we now have a generation of children and young people who are growing up believing that food banks are normal, and haven't known a world and haven't known a UK without. We know that 1 million of 1.1 million of our food parcels across the network last year were given to households with children. Our social security system has to be protecting families who don't have enough money. We need to fully remove that 2-child limit, because we believe at Trussell, and our partners believe, it's the most effective way to protect children from hunger. We can see on the screen the commitment from the Prime Minister that no child should be left hungry. We believe that removing the 2-child limit absolutely fully at in the next budget next week is one surefire way of ensuring that less people. At the moment, every day, the 2-child limit puts 109 more children into poverty, punishing them just for having brothers and sisters. I think what's important to reflect on as well is that it's not just the UK government that have the power to change things. If we live in Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales, we've got parliaments with powers to protect the most vulnerable in society. Local authorities and councils have budgets. Most recently, the Household Support Fund, which is now renamed as the Crisis and Resilience Fund, that local authorities and councils are empowered to decide how to best use that within their local communities. So let's not forget that our local parliaments, our national parliaments, our regional councils and local authorities do have a power and do have some authority to change this as well. Devolved areas. I live in Greater Manchester. Our Mayor, Andy Burnham, has powers that can be put into place, the budgets to do that. So when we're thinking about that acting justly, we're thinking either as an individual or as a church community. I think a starting point is a commitment to understand where the power and decision making lie in our local communities. And I just want to talk about praying for justice as well at this moment, because I often reflect on the fact that when I'm in church, we do pray for people who are in hardship. We pray for people who are facing insecurity and are homeless and struggling to find work and all of those things. But unfortunately, I never hear us praying much to bring about justice, to bring about the solutions to ending that hardship, solutions to ending the pain and the suffering and the stigma that comes with facing hunger and hardship. So perhaps in our own personal prayer and in our communities, we can make a commitment to kind of pray and to bring about justice and to bring about systemic change. And then finally, the third part of that strategy of thinking about how we end hunger together, or how we walk humbly with God. Government policy and policies are not going to solve the problem of hunger and hardship on its own. Fully scrapping the 2-child limit in the upcoming budget and introducing an essentials guarantee would make monumental difference to the number of people facing hunger and hardship and the number of people being driven to the doors of food banks. But it's not going to solve the problem entirely. And many of the other solutions to hunger and hardship can only be resolved by building strong, resilient, and supportive communities. Time and time again, people fall through the cracks that appear in our fractured communities. They don't know where to turn when things get difficult. They don't know how to access the support that they need and require when things get tough. And then they end up being driven to the doors of a food bank. So our churches and Christian organisations and communities are a vital partner in ensuring that we're building strong and safe communities. And a huge part of this concept of walking humbly is to adopt a posture of humility. Sometimes it's okay that we don't have all the answers. Sometimes it's okay to say we don't have the solutions. By remaining humble, we can work alongside people who do have some of the answers, the people who do have the solutions, the people who are being directly affected by hunger and hardship today. So a challenge for all of us this evening, a challenge that I'm continually challenging myself with, is, are we individuals and are we churches and are we a church that's open to accepting this posture and working alongside people who are currently facing hunger and hardship? So what might a church that embraces this concept of social action and social justice look like? These are just a few examples for you to mull over this evening. Core to that is this idea of lived experience, working alongside and with people who have a lived experience of hunger and hardship. That's core to what it means to bring together. And that's the case for hunger and hardship, just as it's the case for people with disabilities or any other community who has that potential to be marginalised, listening to and amplifying the voices of people who are experiencing the results of the injustice. And these are some of the other ways that we might begin to connect social justice and social action as we think upstream about tackling some of the root causes. So, as I say, praying for people for systemic change, seeks to learn from experiences of poverty, shares public info to educate. Do we talk about the rise of hunger and hardship within our church communities and spaces? Do people really know the reality? Engages in justice issues, partners externally. Just as Trussell can't do this on our own, churches also can't do it on their own. They can't create strong, resilient, and safe communities without looking outside the doors and walls of their churches. And then, again, donates food, money, and expertise to their local food bank. As I come to the end of this presentation, I just want to share this quote. from Sam Wells. Some of you may know Sam. He's an author. He's currently an Anglican priest based at St. Martin the Fields in London. And I think this quote kind of sums up and this concept of walking humbly. I think walking humbly is the glue that brings social action and charity and social justice together. So he says, charity and justice need each other. The simplicity of charity is its greatest asset, but it can also become a problem. Stridency of justice can be compelling and energizing, but can also be self-righteous and deflating. Moving from charity to justice isn't simply shifting from a plaster that stops the bleeding to a medicine that cures the illness. Crucial to transformation is not only better laws and policies, but a whole approach to relationship that prioritizes supporting people as they take greater agency in their own lives and walking alongside people as they gain confidence to address their own challenges. Charity can hinder that, but so can justice. Charity can advance that, and so can justice. They are, after all, both expressions of love. And so just to embody that posture of participation, I just want to give the final word to some of our lived experience partners, some of those people who have worked alongside me and others at Trussell who've experienced hunger and hardship and want to use their voice to campaign for change. Going back to Laura, who says, justice without action is like putting a pan of water on a bed and expecting it to boil. Steve says, actions speak louder than words, but combined they are far more powerful. Social justice must align with social action, ensuring equality, dignity, and opportunities for all. It's about addressing systemic barriers, promoting fairness, and empowering marginalised communities, Tony says. And finally, D, people are silenced by oppression every day, and we need to use our voices to challenge things. One drop creates that ripple. So thank you so much for engaging in this talk tonight. I hope it's given some inspiration. As I say, it's a drop in the ocean, as Dee says, in terms of some of the work that we're trying to do. I've tried to share a little bit of everything in the talk tonight. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you and any questions that you might have and any conversations that might follow. So thank you again.
Thank you, Phil, for a very, very shocking and clear presentation with an action-oriented set of tasks for all of us as Christians. So I'm sure there are lots of questions, and you can either put a question in the chat, and Kat will be helping to monitor that. I can't personally see everyone, so we'll need to handle that together. Or you might just want to put up a hand. If I could perhaps just start by clarifying one area, Bill. I've read in the past that one of the problems and one of the issues that people who come to food banks face is simply the inefficiency of the benefits system and payments not being made on time, and that has been said of universal credit. To what how much of a problem is that in terms of all the other reasons for why people are coming to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, John, and thanks for raising it. I think first and foremost, we would say that the biggest problem with the social security system is that it's not secure. It doesn't offer security. So the biggest issue is that it simply is not enough to afford life's essentials, and that's the number one issue. But absolutely right that there are problems with the system in and of itself as well. We talk about the 5-week wait when people first have to sign up to universal credit, which can make people destitute by the time that they're given their first universal credit payment. So absolutely there is huge issues too with the actual navigation of a quite complicated system, and that goes for universal credit and and other parts of the social security system like PIP and things like that. They're confusing to navigate for many people, and they often require, that's why advice services, there are as many. I've just noticed, there's one thing that we do offer in our food banks. In 90% of our food banks is what we call our financial inclusion, which offers advice services. Many of those are linked with citizens advice and other kind of local advice providers to help people navigate that system. So absolutely, the navigation of a very complex system is definitely an issue as well.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions that people have? Yes, there's Gail Ballinger, so if you could unmute. Yes.
I trained as a community worker before becoming a parish priest, but I was also a social responsibility officer in the church. So in the 70s, 80s, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were things called community development projects, which identified many of the causes of poverty. Then there was Faith in the City and Faith in the Countryside, which again identified those issues. Very little seems to have been done about it, except on a voluntary basis. My own area of working with volunteer bureaus, for instance, that's also been closed down. It seems to me that many of the projects that attempt to look at the structural causes of poverty and do something about them are closed down. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, in itself, a horrifying thing. I think the charity sector, the third sector, whatever you want to call it, community sector has suffered hugely over the past few years with community breakdown and just huge lacks of funding. And our food banks themselves haven't been immune to that. And in some ways, our food banks have had to grow and adapt, not just to be food banks that deliver emergency food and give out emergency food, but to plug the gap in some of those community spaces where other community organisations have just gone under through lack of funding and lack of resource. And so it's a huge issue, and we recognise that food banks aren't necessarily the places that should be, providing these community solutions. But many of them have stepped in at a time of where there is very little else in the community to focus on. And a part of our new strategy really recognises the power of community. So there is only so much that a national UK-wide organisation can do. We have a seat at the table to speak to influencers and decision makers at a national and UK-wide level, and that's really important. But we really recognise that solutions have to come from the community, from the ground up, and they may look and feel different in each community, and that's a really core part of my work and kind of the new strategies, that recognition of that the solutions do exist within the community, and how do we fund that and how do we promote that to make sure that they are more resilient.
Judith and then Kat. So Judith first.
I've just been reading a few reports over the last few days about food poverty, or people not having enough food to eat, or eating poor diets. And as well as not being able to afford food, it's flagged up things like fresh, healthy food is often too expensive. People don't always have the facilities to cook food. People don't always have the time to cook food because they're working such long hours or juggling so many responsibilities. And then the power of persuasion of advertising that actually the quick, cheap meal that's ready made is the best option. And I wonder how much that bears on the work that you're doing.
Thank you for that. I think one thing that I'd like to say in response to that to begin with is that we believe that poverty and hardship and the reasons people are being driven to the doors of food banks is a financial issue rather than a food issue. So it's because people do not have enough money in their pockets to afford food, and the issue of financial hardship and poverty and destitution in our community is so multifaceted, and lots of those things that you've just touched on there about not being able to afford more expensive food or fresher food or vegetables and those kind of things, and long working hours that come with people who are facing financial insecurity. All of those things are part of that kind of really complicated, multifaceted issue of financial hardship. As an organisation, we don't have a kind of a food kind of solution in terms of because we focus on that lack of finances that comes with. That's not to say that many of our food banks in the network across the UK are connected with other agencies that promote that. There are some food banks that promote things like healthier food and ways of doing that. Lots of our food banks are kind of standard emergency food parcel. Bear in mind that our parcels within our Trussell network are meant to be emergency food parcels. They are there to ensure that someone can survive for 3 days. But many of our kind of food banks also have a fresh food offer, so that people who are facing hunger and hardship aren't just eating things that are in boxes and tins, but that they do have access to some of that fresh food as well.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It seems to me the overall thing you're saying is actually it's a system in which people don't earn, aren't paid enough, that is really
Yes.
the root cause of everything.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Kat, next, and then there are some questions in the chat that we'll turn to. Kat.
Thanks, John. Yeah, and thanks so much, Phil. Judith, just one reflection that I have on our local food bank is that we have an allotment attached to it. And so the people at ours check whether there is the capacity to cook. And also the churches that run warm spaces for people to come and get a free meal and company. In ours, we're starting to invite people into the kitchen to learn how to prep soup and then take some home. But my question for Phil around the financial side of the challenges was, as much as anything, I think literacy, financial literacy, but also literacy is a huge problem, and digital literacy. I was working at Citizens Advice in Morecambe and Lancaster when Universal Credit was coming in. And if you didn't have an email address, you could not get Universal Credit. And there were people sitting in pubs scamming people who struggled with their reading or didn't have a phone, saying, I'll set it up for you, and diverting money into the wrong places. We used to have people coming in who are frightened to open an envelope, frightened to open an electricity envelope, wouldn't know how to get a cheap tariff, frightened to engage with people. And so there are lots of people, I think, who need almost an advocate, an ambassador, someone to speak for them, a trusted friend. I don't know whether that has any resonance for you.
Yeah, it really absolutely does, and it's one of the key reasons that so many of our food banks have linked up with Citizens, Citizens Advice and other kind of local advice services. Is that recognition of digital literacy. You're absolutely right. You cannot access Universal Credit without an online account. It's as simple as that. And the cost of running smartphones and things like that is a barrier to people who need to access that social security. And we've seen incredible the right levels of because of as to what John alluded to earlier, it's a very, very complicated system for people to try and navigate, and it takes often specialist advisors from the CA to help people navigate that system and work out what benefits they actually are deserving of and that they're entitled to. So it's a huge issue as well that definitely contributes to and makes people's lives harder who are facing that hunger and hardship for sure.
So turning to the chat, Ruth is asking, our local group of churches, she says, Churches Against Poverty, has joined Citizens UK as a way of engaging in justice work. Does Trussell link to Citizens UK?
Thank you for the question, Ruth. It's a great question. Great to hear that you've got a group of Churches Against Poverty already. So thank you for doing that and partnering. We ourselves at Trussell have our own community organising programme. So over the last number of years, we've trained up and funded local organisers within the food bank settings themselves to work within the local community to embed those principles of community organising. So we've worked alongside citizens alliances. I've in former roles, I've been involved in Citizens UK and Greater Manchester Citizens, and so many of our local organisers work alongside Citizens UK alliances. But really, I absolutely believe that community organising and embedding the principles of community organising within our communities to bring people together to find solutions together that are community focused is a really important part of the solution.
Thank you.
Karen asks, how can we help beyond food banks? What is the best way? Shared meals, cooking classes, etc. How would you respond to that?
It's a great question again, Karen. And I think just to say again, just to reiterate again, that fundamentally, hunger and hardship is about it's a money issue. It's that people don't have enough money in their pockets, and that's unless that's changed, then any other kind of solutions beyond that aren't good enough. Giving emergency food parcels to people is not what people deserve. It's not dignified. We try and make it as dignified as possible, but any attempts to try and feed people who cannot pay for the food themselves is in my opinion is a failure of our communities, and it is a failure of society. But that's not to say that whilst we are trying to target that, and that idea of ending hunger today is still vital, as I was talking about earlier. So absolutely, I think what community meals do, I think, is a really interesting thing, and is that some of our food banks are partnered with churches who provide community meals. Is that it also provides a space for community. And we think back to that statistic that I shared at the beginning of my presentation, that 1 in 4 people who access a food bank are in severe social isolation, and so people need community, and so spaces that people can gather, and that involves food, then excellent, because food is a great way of gathering round and sharing. And so I think community meals is one way of kind of, yes, providing food, but also providing a space for community as well. I think is so vital.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mark now, who's got a hand raised, and then some other questions that are in the chat. So Mark.
Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful presentation. There's so many issues it raises. The questions I put in the chat was, moving upstream, can we join modern monetary theory with a sort of universal basic income and persuade government to add these on top of full universal basic services to really finally defeat poverty? So I suppose that's a question about advocacy towards government for big policy change. And I don't know whether everyone else has noticed that the new leader of the Green Party is starting to push onto the political agenda these sort of things. He hasn't quite linked modern monetary theory with universal basic income yet, but he's going to go. I think he's going to edge that direction, because he's on the taxing wealth really at the moment. I think he's taken the creation care, the green agenda, as already said, and that's why he's moving on to the inequality agenda, which is really what we're talking about tonight. So, do you think Trussell should get in behind that sort of campaign and give it a bit more push to try and support him in the direction that he's trying to pull the politics of the UK towards?
Great question, Mark, and thanks so much. First thing I want to say is that I am definitely no economist, and I'm not. It's not one of my areas of expertise. But I really value that, and I think it's a really important part of the debate. And I also recognise that. So I'm a Roman Catholic, and under our previous Pope Francis, he established a Vatican Commission to explore universal basic income as a concept, and really kind of saw how universal basic income could quite easily fit alongside the kind of Catholic social teaching that we have around the dignity of individuals. As Trussell, as a spokesperson for Trussell tonight, the universal basic income isn't a policy that we're currently pushing. I think we recognise that that concept of guarantee our essentials is a kind of a big enough target to be facing at the moment, and that's a kind of maybe an initial step to recognizing that there is a basic level of income that people need in order to not only survive but like flourish within our society and within our communities. So it's not, the UBI is not something that Trussell is currently kind of on board in campaigning with. It's almost like sort of one step at a time. But on a personal level, I think it's interesting what some of our churches and some of our economists are kind of exploring with that. And I would say one to watch. I think, Mark, it would be my answer there.
Okay, and another question. This is from John Morley. With ultra-processed foods being identified medically as harmful, how is this addressed in the food bank support?
Great question, John. Thanks so much. And I'll be honest, I think it goes back to the point of, I think each food bank would address this differently at a local level. It gives me a good opportunity to say that. So the food banks within our community are separate charities. So they kind of belong to our community, but whilst they follow our kind of principles, a lot of them have their own kind of policies and procedures that they kind of follow at their local level. And as I suggested earlier, that our food parcels from Trussell food banks are there for people who are in emergency crisis. They're not meant to be a long-term solution. They're meant to be, a one-off kind of support. And most people, the average that someone needs to use a Trussell food bank is just over 2. So on the whole, the people that are accessing, that are being driven to Trussell food banks are not reliant on emergency food parcels to sustain them. That's not to say that this issue isn't a pertinent one. I'll be completely honest. I don't kind of work as closely in terms of that operational support at that level. If you want to email me, John, I could probably find you an answer on that if that's something that I can assist with after the meeting. But I think it's a really interesting point. But as to say, it is a stopgap emergency kind of parcel that we're trying to give. So hopefully people find themselves, not having to rely on whatever's in our parcel for much too long.
Yeah. Judith, you've got your hands up, so over to you.
Okay. So if I've got £10, is it better for me to go and buy some coffee at Tesco's and put it in the food bank, or wouldn't it be better if I just gave you the £10 direct, and then you buy food more efficiently, or buy the food that's wanted?
Really, really great question, Judith. I'll be honest, coffee's always wanted. So if you throw coffee into one of the boxes at the supermarket, I know that will be gratefully received. But as you can see from the stats that I was sharing earlier, like so many food banks now are purchasing food, and they they can and do, you know, purchase that at kind of bulk to make that a little bit cheaper. There's no right or wrong answer there. It's whatever you feel most comfortable doing. You know, I know that for many food banks, they don't like the fact they have to buy food. They see it as, you know, a very odd solution. But either way, that I know that local food banks are always grateful for donations of food and products and toiletries as well. Just want to remind people that toiletries are often forgotten about and are one of life's essentials that when people are facing hardship, they can't always afford. If you go on food banks' websites, they will often have a list, or their social media, they'll often have a list of the most in need items, so the things that are running low within their stocks for that week or that month. So before you do a shop, if you've got chance, do check that out. There's also a brilliant app called Bank the Food, which is available on app stores, which shows you what products are needed and what products are low for your local food bank, which you could have a little look at before you or whilst you're at the supermarket, which is always a little bit of a handy tool.
There's a question. It's quite a long one, but very interesting, I think, from Ricky. So I'll read it. Often mental health difficulties and/or neurodivergence are huge contributing factors to poverty. Many statutory mental health services are not up to genuinely helping people in distress, especially those with more complex presentations, and services supporting those individuals, neurodivergent individuals without intellectual disability are virtually non-existent. This means that some people are becoming or are becoming simply unable to work to support themselves. Benefits are difficult to obtain, and as you said, usually insufficient. Disability benefits can be elusive. The cycle of mental health and/or neurodivergence and poverty becomes a vicious cycle. Could you please comment on this and what you see might be possible ways forward?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricky, for that. You've identified a real core issue of people facing hunger and hardship. As I said, the people, the reasons for hunger and hardship are so multifaceted and complicated, but we often find mental health within that neurodivergence as being a key factor for some of the reasons as to why people can't work. And then the social security system is difficult to navigate and insufficient, and therefore people fall into hunger and hardship. Really interesting and good point. And I think we worked really hard as an organisation with our partners a few months back when the government had announced those changes to disability benefit in the PIP payments, and we believe that a lot of our hard work in campaigning and mobilising our food banks and mobilising our supporters across the country went a long way in ensuring that backbench MPs kind of forced the hand of the government, and they were forced to U-turn on that, and we're really proud and pleased about that, because it would have caused even more harm for people who had disabilities, both physical and mental. Some of our food banks find that that have relationships with their kind of local Mind organisation or other mental health charities, so that they can bridge the gap, so that people who are identified as having mental health issues who are accessing the food bank can be signposted to community organisations or charities where, as you've rightly identified, the statutory services just do not have the capacity to adequately deal with the amount of people that they have to deal with. So I think one of the solutions is forcing the hand of and really campaigning for good systems, as we've talked about already, easy to navigate systems for people who are facing disability, both mental and physical, ensuring that that those systems are adequate and that they pay enough, but really kind of forcing as well, recognizing that part of the, the complications and the links with health and poverty, and ensuring that the policies are there so that there are enough statutory services so that people, and that they're easy to navigate as well, and that people know how to access them. One of the, as I alluded to in my presentation, one of the things we recognize is that people just don't know where to turn to when things get tough. And so how can we make it easier for people to access those services? What's the role of our communities in making resilient, strong communities so that people know where to access when they need to, so that they aren't falling into that crisis? It's a really complicated question. It's a really complicated issue. But I think we're learning from what our communities are doing and trying to work with communities to establish the best possible practice, while also consistently saying to government that these things aren't right, that systems must be easy to navigate, and that we do need more statutory services as well.
Thank you.
There's a question from Marissa, which I'll paraphrase. Basically, is there more to be done with school meals to support food bank users, giving better food and value for children? I know that currently infants receive free school meals, but at the upper levels, no. So is that something you have a view on at Trussell?
I will give a personal view, I think, rather than a Trussell view on this, just because I'm not 100% where we stand in terms of a policy on free school meals. I think I would say again that, first and foremost, we want people to have enough money in their pockets to be able to choose whether they have school meals or whether they can provide their own nutritious, good meals for their children. We want that to be able to be a choice for people. I think there are some really good examples of kind of universal free school meals, which, there are issues around, children who do have to access free school meals and those that don't, and then the barriers and things that are put in place and the differences in those children. I think that our food banks and the food banks in our network are doing some brilliant work in kind of bridging the gap during school holidays and really recognizing holiday hunger, and have pivoted towards that, alongside the commitment to providing emergency food parcels for anybody facing hunger and hardship. A real recognition that it might just be a stopgap, that a person might not require an emergency food parcel until it gets to the school holidays and suddenly they've got to feed their child for 3 meals a day, and a stopgap in that. So I think it goes back to, that point about nutrition again is really, really important, and how we're providing really good food for children that they really need. I think again, it's there are good policies, and I think the idea of universal free school meals is a good policy, but again, it shouldn't negate the fact that people need more money in their pockets to be able to choose what's best for their own children.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think we're probably moving towards the end of our time together, but are there any final points, any final questions?
Could I just mention that I've just downloaded Bank the Food, the app you mentioned, Phil, and unbelievably, it's got the Isle of Man Food Bank on it and their urgent needs. So that's a really good tool if anybody's got an iPhone with an app store on it.
Could I just mention the idea that some of the poverty, food poverty in particular, is also an inability to know how to cook food. One of the things I remember in projects in places like Corby and various other places is we had to actually set up some projects that taught people how to actually handle things like raw vegetables and things like that. It isn't just not having it, it's also not knowing how to handle it.
Yeah, I think in some scenarios that is absolutely the case. I know for a fact it's not the case for lots of people I know who've accessed a food bank. I know but certainly, and there are food banks in our network where there is a higher rate of people that might affect that are looking and have looked towards solutions in terms of like cooking classes and how to use food and access food and what's good food and things like that as well.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. Kat's not seeing anyone. So, Phil, thank you very, very much for what's not only been for me an hour where I've learned a lot, but you also articulated the issues very, very clearly and cogently and made us think about what we can do. So, Phil, thank you.